Well, it's fantastic to see people coming into our virtual meeting room. It is 1 p.m. I'm sure that there'll be more people coming in, but I would really like to get started because we have a lot to cover in today's seminar. So I would like to welcome you all to our first virtual La Trobe Asia academic seminar series, China in Focus. This is a 6-week seminar series that will be held every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Melbourne time, which showcases China-related research across a diverse array of topics. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the elders of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits. And I would like to pay respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who might be watching this seminar today. I am delighted that our first speaker in our China in Focus series is Dr. Geoff Raby AO, who will be talking about his recently published book by Melbourne University Press called China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the Global Order. So this is a terrific read and it's selling very successfully. So we are delighted that Geoff has been able to join us. So Dr. Raby was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011. After 27 years in the public service, he completed his ambassadorial term and in 2011 established Geoff Raby and Associates. As many of you would know, Dr. Raby has had a distinguished diplomatic career and has held a number of senior positions in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, including as the Deputy Secretary of the Department from 2002 to 2006. Dr. Raby is the chair of the Murdoch University Vice-Chancellor's Advisory Board, Western Sydney University's Australia-China Institute of Arts and Culture, and Viz Asia at the New South Wales Gallery. He is also a member of the board of the Garvan Foundation. And of course, in addition to all of those roles, Dr. Raby is also an advisory board member for La Trobe Asia. In recognition of his contributions to advancing relations between Australia and China and his contributions to multilateral trade diplomacy, Dr. Raby was awarded the Order of Australia in June 2019. Welcome, Geoff. It is terrific to have you here today. Just before we get into the discussion, I wanted to make our audience members aware that there is a discount today for people who wish to purchase the book, and Diana will be putting the details in the chat function. I think we'll also provide those details when we send the email out that follows today's event. So throughout the seminar, feel free to think about some questions that you might like to ask Geoff at the end of the seminar. Now, when we get to the Q&A period, what I will ask you to do is to use the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom, the Zoom page, and use the hands up function. I'll show you what I mean here. This one here, to get my attention, and I will call on you to ask your question. And throughout the seminar, I would ask that audience members please keep their microphones on mute unless I call on you to participate to ask your question. But for now, I will hand it over to Geoff to present on his book. And thank you, Geoff.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks very much to La Trobe Asia. It's great to be here participating in this seminar. And in the introduction, Beck, you omitted to say that I'm a graduate several times over from La Trobe University. So I'm quite proud of that and always love to be associated with La Trobe in whatever way. So welcome everybody. And as it's an academic seminar, I might be a little more academic in my presentation on this occasion, and rather less public policy advisory, as what really my professional background has been for the last couple of decades. And to that end, I think I might just say a little bit about how the book came about, and to give you some of the sort of intellectual background to it. whilst the timing of it's been remarkable, and I thank the government every day for some new initiative or action, such as the tearing up of Victoria's Belton Road MOU last night, all of which is very good for attention on the subject and hence sales of the book. But the book really actually has a very long origin. Not long after I'd been ambassador, and I should say I first went to China in 1986 as first secretary in the embassy on what then was just a 1-year assignment to try and get a professional economic reporting capacity established in our embassy. And I was the first economist ever posted to an Australian embassy because we just didn't link foreign policy and economics in those days as we do now. And for various reasons, 1 year became 2 and then 2 became 5. And that was a time when the maximum posting in a difficult post like Beijing was just 2 years, but I was delighted to spend 5 years. So I saw the beginning really of the Chinese economic reform, open door policy, the policies that were adopted then that have led us to where we are today. But when I finished being ambassador in 2011, around that time I read 2 quite influential books, which went into a lecture I was invited to give by Monash University, which was the Richard Larkin oration, which I gave in August 2012. And the 2 books, one was Kissinger's on China. And being a realist foreign policy person myself, I'm very much influenced, of course, by Kissinger and attracted to his way of viewing the world. And I think it's an excellent book. And for those with not a lot of background on China, it's a wonderful way into China's foreign policy, how it sees itself and its place in the world. But it had a curious ending, and it might have been simply because he wanted to finish the book and couldn't think of how to round it off. But he made a very, what I thought almost naive assertion that the future of the world looked like it would be managed through G2, an ever-increasing powerful China, but a still dominant US. And essentially the G2 would be leading the world in a cooperative fashion, but the order, the rules-based order as we call it, which actually is a misnomer, but the post-49 system, established largely by the United States, would continue to be the dominant system. He then, though, went on and asserted, and this was what really got me thinking about the subject and led to the book, he asserted that China historically had not been an expansionary power and therefore would not be an expansionary power into the future. And I thought, hello, I mean, this is, for a guy like Kissinger, this is an odd way to base an odd foundation, a very weak foundation on which to base your security policy, an assumption about the future behavior of another state. And I even think the history is very debatable. It's certainly true that earlier dynasties in China, such as the Ming, were not expansionary, but the Manchu were very expansionary. And the Manchu borders basically, brought in Tibet, Xinjiang, all of Mongolia, and half of Kazakhstan as we know it today. And of course, interestingly enough, and I point this out in the book, Taiwan today, the KMT in particular, on their maps of China show the Qing borders, not the current communist borders, which are much smaller than the expansionary Qing. But the argument to that, of course, is that, well, the Qing weren't really Chinese. They weren't Han Chinese. They were invaders from essentially the Mongolian steppe. And therefore, it still stands that China historically hasn't been an expansionary power. But I'm still left with a quandary about, how can you base security policy on such an assertion? But that led me to ask the key question, which really did lead to the book, and that was, assuming the worst about China, assuming China inherently is an expansionary power, what then is China's capacity to actually expand? What are the constraints in other words, on China's power. And I guess I've come at this geopolitical question reflecting my background as a trained economist. Economists tend to think in terms of constraints and opportunity costs and those sorts of choices. I found in the strategic literature a much more willingness to just think about what's possible and talk and write about what's possible rather than attaching probabilities to the possibilities. And from a practical public policy point of view, what really matters is trying to understand the probability of certain actions. So I started to think about China's constraints in response to Kissinger's assertion, and that basically led to a big chunk of what the current book is about. And it's in the second part of the book that I refer to China as Prometheus bound. That is, it's a constrained superpower. And it's an unusual way of looking at China. But given I've lived for the last 13 years in Beijing, and for much of that time, I've been involved when I was in government, for example, trying to understand how China thought about the world, how China sees the world around it, and trying to explain that to the Australian government and Australian business and academics and so on. It gives you a different perspective on how the world looks in security terms if you view it from a Chinese perspective. And what I argue is that China's a constrained superpower, first of all, because of geography. It has 14 countries on its border and 22,000 kilometers of land border to defend. So if you're sitting in Beijing, the security issues are not so much in the Pacific or the Western Pacific, but rather, as they've always been for China, in Eurasia, in the Asian landmass, where all of China's security threats and challenges until relatively recent times have come from. Secondly, I argue China is still an empire with unresolved territorial issues inside its borders. Think Xinjiang, much of the news today, Tibet, Taiwan, of course, and more recently, Hong Kong. So again, from a Beijing security perspective, this really matters. You're still trying to hold an empire together. Thirdly, and this is probably the most original aspect of the book, I argue that China is massively constrained by its resource endowment. When you consider China for 3,000 years, or however long you wish to measure it, was basically self-sufficient in all its resources, raw materials, and energy. And then only from the mid-1990s does China start importing things that are critical to its sustaining economic growth and prosperity. So as recently as 1995, China is self-sufficient in crude oil. By the turn of the decade, early 2000, China is starting to import a lot of crude oil. By the middle of the decade, it's the world's biggest importer of crude oil, and so it goes. And from all the main commodity and resource groups, except for rare earths, China has, in a period of a decade, gone from being largely self-sufficient, able to rely on its own internal resources, to becoming utterly dependent on world markets for everything it needs to survive. So from a Beijing perspective again, this is a horrendous security vulnerability and challenge. And in the 2000s, when this was happening, and there was a belated but then sudden realization that China was becoming utterly dependent on the rest of the world for these things, and of course very much on Australia for iron ore, and this was the genesis of the super resource cycle of the last decade, or of the first decade of the 21st century. The leadership felt that this was a major security risk, and especially because nearly all of those resources and energy, in fact all of them, traveled to China via the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. Doesn't surprise you when you look at it from this perspective, that the South China Sea had, in that first decade of the 21st century, become such a prominent issue of security concern for China. Now, we may reject and are disturbed and upset by China's behavior in the South China Sea, and it's a assertive foreign policy there. And that is a perfectly legitimate concern. But at the same time, of course, from Beijing's perspective, and they use this phrase over and again, is that the Straits of Malacca are like the boot on China's throat, because the United States then and now and for a long time into the future will have the naval preponderance to close those strategic choke points in a heartbeat. And in many ways, this is actually the origin of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, and I talk a lot about this in the book, began long before Xi Jinping stood up in Astana in Kazakhstan in October 23 and announced the Belt and Road. And in fact, it was a barely formed policy idea when he announced it. And this often happens in public policy. A leader will get up and have a speech, and the speech will announce an idea or a policy, and most officials have no idea what the leader's talking about. And this was very much the case with Belt and Road Initiative. And for a couple of years afterwards, people didn't know which was the belt and which was the road, and who was in and who was out. There's obviously a lot more clarity around it today, but it began very, very much as a way of looking for alternative trade routes for China to avoid this incredible strategic vulnerability that they suddenly found themselves with respect to resources and energy traveling through the South China Sea and Straits of Malacca. And so one of the first Belt and Road initiatives was actually a rail line from Chongqing to Duisburg in Germany. And that goes back to about 2006. And in the same year, I actually traveled over the Kundra Pass from Xinjiang to the Hunza Valley in northern Pakistan. And on the Pakistan side of the border, on the Chinese side, it was already a wonderfully paved, smooth road, but the terrain is not so challenging. The Pakistan side is very challenging. But that was September 2006, 7 years before Xi articulated the Belt and Road concept. And there was a string of Chinese surveyors all the way through the Hunza Valley surveying the road for its eventual upgrade, because this road is the only land artery between Central Asia and the Indian Ocean. And of course, now it's connected to the Gwalior port in Pakistan. And through this initiative, China's been able to establish strategic influence. Dominance still might be too strong a word, but certainly considerable influence over Central Asia, and has opened up Central Asia to a direct to a sea route that leads directly from the Indian Ocean to Europe. So these were all major initiatives well before there was a political articulation of what Belt and Road was all about. But I belabored the point really to talk about, to emphasize the extent to which China felt so strategically vulnerable when it became dependent on the rest of the world for resources and energy. And I should just give another example. One of the other early Belt and Road projects, which went into operation, was finished and went into operation in 2015, was a dual gas and crude oil pipeline across Burma into Kunming, capital of Yunnan province. And when the oil started flowing through that pipeline in 2015, it was the first time China imported crude oil from the Gulf without having to go through the Straits of Malacca. And it's worth reflecting that when Vasco da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope, I think somewhere in the late second half of the 15th century, when you change trade routes, you can change the world. And it's these are non-marginal developments, I think, in global strategic settings. So the other constraint, which I've written about, which is geography, empire, resources and energy, and the other one is soft power. And I argue that China's constrained in terms of global influence and shaping the world by a lack of soft power. And I argue that that's because whilst Chinese culture is traditional, historically, Chinese culture has been enormously influential, very influential in the West and elsewhere, and is much loved and admired by so many different people. Contemporary Chinese culture and the way China tries to project soft power today, unfortunately, is systemically constrained by being refracted, if you like, through the Communist Party's propaganda structures. So Chinese soft power, official soft power today, comes out at the other end like propaganda, and whilst it might sell well inside China, certainly doesn't have much attraction for people outside of China. So consequently, whilst China can't match the US in hard power, it will one day perhaps, but it's a long way behind still. And its soft power, despite vast investment in soft power, that really has been found wanting and is unlikely to expand China's influence. And in fact, I really think there's a very big problem for China, because its soft power and the way it's viewed around the world is going backwards quite quickly. China finds itself really, in terms of instruments of statecraft, left with very few. And I've gathered them together in a box, I guess, which I call sharp power. Now, it's not my invention, but I find sharp power is a useful term for things like influence that China seeks to exert via interfering in domestic politics, through cyber interference or cyber warfare, just through bribery and corruption, and any other vehicle that may be used. That doesn't fall into soft power or military power categories. And so I think in terms of statecraft, what we see more of, or are seeing more of, and will in future, because China is unable to influence the external environment in its favor, using more traditional soft power mechanism, it is reverting more and more to sharp power. And Australia has been very much at the receiving end of that, both through influence and through economic coercion, which for China are all seen as legitimate instruments of statecraft. We quite rightly have a different view, but that's how Beijing sees the world. So essentially, you have this enormous economy, a major global power, the dominant power in the East Asian region, but it's constrained and it's limited. And I think it's very important that we understand that, because I think we have tended to, in the West, exaggerate in all respects the China threat and China's capacity to actually shape the world in its own interests. So all of that, as I began by saying, was stimulated by reading Kissinger's On China and then just thinking through what were the constraints on China's ability to act, and the extent to which China would be an existential threat to Australia, which I reject and argue that it is not an existential threat to Australia because of all these constraints. But there's another element of another book I read around the same time, which I think is very, very important, and that was Hugh White's book called the China Choice. And like all good books, and particularly good selling books, a lot of people know the title, but actually have never read the book, because people mistakenly think that the China choice that Hugh is writing about is a choice that Australia has to make between the US and China, between our security, our economic interests. But his China choice is the choice the United States would have to make. Now, remember, he's writing, I think, in 2010, 2011, so it's a decade ago almost. But he saw the inexorable rise of China and concluded that at some point, the US, which then was following policies of engagement with China, would have to decide whether it would continue to engage with China and provide China with strategic space, or whether it would resist China's rise, like great powers have done mainly done so throughout history. Not always. We think of the example of Great Britain co-opting and cooperating with the United States as a rising power, but by and large, history is full of examples of great powers resisting the ascendant power. Although in no way is Hugh's book about a sort of predetermined Thucydides trap, but rather he's saying this will be a decision the US will have to make. And we now know what decision the US made. From about 2014 or thereabouts, the US think tanks, conservative think tanks, increasingly started to define China as a strategic threat and to move away from engagement to containment. Now, none of this happened overnight, and it's been an evolving policy, but it probably first reached its clearest policy articulation in the national security strategy put out by the National Security Agency in October 2017, when explicitly China was defined as a strategic threat and that the policy was shift from engagement to containment or competition. And so Hugh concluded his book by warning Australia that the China choice the US makes would have profound implications for Australia one way or the other. And we also know now what those implications are for Australia, flowing from the US deciding to treat China as a strategic competitor. From that, we have basically joined ourselves to the hip with the United States. And although there's no respect that China is our strategic competitor, we have, since about 2017, consistently adopted policies that treat China as if it were our strategic competitor. Now, I, for one, have been a big critic of Australia's involvement in the quadrilateral grouping. It's had many, many different names, and at one point for many years, it was the name One Shall Not Speak or Murmur, but now it's come out of the shadows and it's in full light, and it's meeting at summit level, heads of government, and it's going to be the agency by which Australia will hope to push back with the United States against China. The problem I have with us being part of the quadrilateral had nothing to do with, and I'll get onto this a bit when we talk a little bit about policy in a minute, with us hedging and pushing back on China and raising the cost to China of bad behavior. They're all things we need to find ways to do. The problem with the Quad in particular is that 3 of the members of the Quad are China's strategic competitors. US, obviously, is the dominant power, Japan for all its historical and other reasons, and India, like Japan, with very live territorial issues still unresolved. We don't fit any of those categories. And in my view, we have no business being there. But as I said, we do need to develop policies that will hedge. But before I go there, just to finish off on Hugh's book. So we have found ourselves in the middle of the greatest power shift that's happened in modern history. But I would argue, because we chose to maintain what we believe as the sort of the natural order of things and align ourselves so closely with the United States, that our policy, whatever we say, is basically a policy based on resisting China's rise and containment. And that seems rather odd for a country that depends so heavily on China as an economic partner and will continue to do so for as far as the eye can see. And at the same time, we are in the region where China is located, and it is already the dominant power in the region. So we have made the choice, along with the United States, and are in we are now living through the very, very real and challenging foreign policy challenges that Hugh imagined all that time ago when he wrote his book. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, I think we need to recognise the world we're in now, and part of the title of the book is the New World Order, a new global order. And the order has changed, in my view, for all time. As I indicated a bit earlier, we can argue about whether there ever was a single rules-based order led by the US, but there certainly was a liberal order that was dominated by US power, which no longer is the case. The unilateral moment, unipolar moment has gone. We're in a multipolar world. I think everybody now would start to agree with that. But what I argue in the book that's emerged and already has emerged, but it's not well recognized, is that the order now comprises basically two substantial bounded orders. One that looks and feels a bit like the old order as we understood it, led by the United States, but another order that is already led by China. And this order basically embraces much of, if not all, of Eurasia and various other parts of the world, large swathes of Africa and so on. And this has all the characteristics of an order. It has a single dominant power that provides stability in the order. And it also has institutional arrangements which shape and define the order. And again, something we don't talk much about in Australia is for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, initiated, conceived, and created by China, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Development Bank. There's a lot of multilateral architecture has been created, and then you overlay that with the Belt and Road Initiative, all driven by Beijing. And if you look at what these bodies are doing, they're doing things that are very conventional, like standard setting, and rule making. Even if the rules aren't binding rules, they're making rules and setting standards and basically shaping a parallel order. And Huawei is a very good example of this. Whatever you think of us banning Huawei, good or bad, I don't know. Although I have problems with the diplomacy, how we managed it. It is quite clear that Huawei is the digital backbone of Eurasia, stretching from Beijing to Warsaw, if not beyond. And this will only gain more momentum. So that's the sort of world we find ourselves having to navigate. And I guess in many ways where my book ends up is that in this very challenging for Australia world, and all the old certainties have gone, and we cannot, as we have throughout all our history, rely on a single dominant power whose values we share. We've got nothing left, and we can't defend the country, although I do argue for increased military expenditure. I do argue for hardening our defences in cyber and anti-foreign interference and so on. Really, all we have left to work with is diplomacy. And yet, at a time when diplomacy has never been more important, foreign policy is increasingly being weaponized in Canberra, taken over by the security, intelligence and defence agencies, especially with respect to China. And investment and resources in diplomacy are being run down. But to give people a sense of hope and possibility, I set out in the book a bit of a brief history of Australia's diplomacy of the last 20 years, or 30 years, where as an active middle power diplomatic actor, we were able to do a whole lot of things which increased our security and prosperity, and basically contributed to a much better international system. And we were very good. APEC, for example, was our initiative, and we created APEC. We created the Cairns Group of Agricultural Free Trading Countries and got agricultural trade for the first time brought into the global system of rules, which was of enormous benefit to developing countries. There's a whole lot of stuff that we did because we had strong political leadership of our diplomatic effort and well-resourced well-resourced diplomatic service. And I feel that's the only way we can deal with the rise of China, and how we need to position ourselves. We ought to develop strategies of hedging, which are not containment, but are about putting together alliances and coalitions of countries that when China leans on one, China knows it leans on all, and that there will be costs. And that can operate at a smaller, narrow regional level or more multilaterally. And equally, it shouldn't be defined by geography. For example, there's a very good case, and you see some ideas like this starting to come out of Britain now, where there's no reason why Australia wouldn't work with across Europe with like-minded democracies, arguing human rights cases, for example, and taking up those issues. But there's no value for Australia and no possibility of any progress if we want to try and do these things on our own. And equally, we have to have an independent standing, an authenticity about our foreign policy, so that we're not just seen to be a cipher for the United States, which we so often are. And I'll stop on this point, but I've often said that China's so big, powerful, and ugly these days, and I think we're seeing this being lived out at the very moment. China has no need to talk to the monkey if it can go straight to the organ grinder. And so China stopped speaking to us because they regard us as the monkey. But of course, dialogue between China and the US continues. And that's all to the good, of course. So, Beck, look, I might stop at that point. That's a bit of a coverage of the book, and take some questions.
Well, there's certainly a lot that you have covered in that discussion, and I'm sure that we have plenty of questions from the audience. So if you can please put up your hand using the reaction function, I might kick us off with a question about the nature of order. And you talk in your book and in your presentation about parallel orders, an old sort of regional or global order that was led by the United States, and a new challenger order that's being led by China. I'm wondering where you stand on the debates in the strategic circles around the Cold War 2.0. Do you see what's emerging as being similar to the strategic competition and containment strategies between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or are you sort of talking about something different emerging? And the other question I'd ask about, and one of the things that I find unusual about the rules-based order is that what China seems to be wanting is actually quite a traditional order based on norms of Westphalian sovereignty, a point that is raised in your book. What do you see as being the driving? Why has this narrative of a rules-based order emerged in your view? Why has it been something that states have adopted in their strategic narratives when they're talking particularly about China and its role in the international and regional order?
Yeah, great questions. I'm not sure if I can do them justice, Beck, but they're great. Look, on the Cold War one, I can probably deal with that more quickly. I just think the world is so different, and China is such a different power, that it just doesn't make any sense to me to talk about Cold War 2.0. I just don't recognize it. For a start, China is not an ideologically driven power. It's not pursuing an ideological agenda. It doesn't, and maybe I should have made this clear in my presentation. I mean, what I argue in the book is that China's grand strategy is based on weakness, not strength. China's grand strategy has two key components. Both are internal. One is just to keep the integrity of the Chinese state, geographical integrity of the Chinese state together. And you need to go back to the founding of the People's Republic in 49. What the communists took over in China in 49 wasn't a state. It wasn't like the Bolsheviks taking over an established state or others doing so. They occupied shards of territory across this vast area we call China, and then they had to piece it together and weld it together to create the People's Republic of China, a state. So territorial integrity, which is actually a very internally focused concern, is a dominant consideration in the grand strategy. And secondly is to keep the Communist Party in power. And both are mutually reinforcing. You need a strong centralized power like the Communist Party to hold the place together and to defend the place against foreigners who will always try and tear it apart. If you lost any territory, if you showed any weakness or ceded any territory, the Communist Party would be finished, or whoever the ruling party was at the time. So this is very, very different than a ideologically engaged Soviet Union that also had a policy of global revolution and expanding its influence globally through changing political regimes around the world. Secondly, on the Cold War, China's so deeply integrated economically in every way. So like we're having all this discussion, terrible stuff happening between Australia and China. Yep. But last year, China was the single biggest recipient globally of inward foreign investment. More money went into China than went out of China. It's just not in any way a meaningful comparison. Good for journalists, perhaps, but I don't think it has any analytical fiber. The rules-based one is very interesting as well. I'm not sure if I'm going to come at this in a way that you were thinking, but look, we bang on in Australia endlessly about the rules-based order. We assume that there's a single rules-based order that everybody recognises and subscribes to. That's because the dominant power in Australia are like two drops of water in terms of values, global outlook, and our belief in legal processes, rules-based processes. But there are, in fact, many different orders. And so, for example, take the South China Sea and the International Court of Arbitration's decision in The Hague in 2016, July 2016. The US is not a member of the Law of the Sea Convention. It's therefore not party to that judgment. China is, and China exercised the right not to be subjected to its jurisdiction for this case. Australia has done that. Other states have done that. But we ignored all of that. We got a legal outcome, and then we started lecturing China on following the rules and we've got to be part of a rules-based order. It's largely self-serving. I mean, it'd be wonderful if there was such an order. And the closest we have to it really is within the WTO. And unfortunately, the Trump administration spent the last 4 years trying to wreck the WTO and refusing to appoint appellate body judges and so on. So maybe that's a bit discursive by way of an answer on that. But I think there's a large amount of ideology on our side around the notion of rules-based order. But I do also think you make a very good point that in some ways, China's a bit old-fashioned about this. It's avowedly a revisionist power because it doesn't feel that it needs and should sign up to every rules-based arrangement in the world simply because they exist. And China's view is that, well, we were often not part of negotiating those rules, so why should we be bound by those rules? And I think that's a perfectly legitimate position for a state to hold, even if it's one that we don't like to see them hold. But you go back to, I'll finish on this. You go back to Bob Zelik's thing, 2007, about China becoming a responsible stakeholder. And I remember at the time, Kevin Rudd embraced this and he loved the notion of, was in all his speeches, China becoming a responsible stakeholder. But what does that mean? A responsible stakeholder in a US-led order with rules that China had no part in negotiating. And so quite realistically, why would China say, yes, we want to be a responsible stakeholder in that system? It's not a system that we help shape or create. Now you flip it over. When China created the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, this is a legitimate, proper, multilateral, rules-based organization. And it's good to see that Australia finally got over the line and joined it. But in that, China was saying, look, we tried to reform the IMF, the World Bank. No one would let us reform these bodies to reflect our weight in the international economy. So bugger it, we're going to go off and set up our own. But they set about, in a very deliberate way, creating a proper rules-based institution. And why wouldn't a second economy in the world be able to do that? But of course, the US refused to join, tried to stop us joining, and Japan and Canada have still not joined. And it's bizarre because for Japan, being outside of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is not only against Japan's own interests, but Japan would have been a dominant influence in shaping the bank in ways which we would find quite acceptable. As it is, we find the operation of the bank acceptable. But so it's a contest over rules and whose rules will apply to whom.
Well, we have one hand up, so please do use the reactions function and put your hand up if you have a question for Geoff. But I'll invite John Neve to unmute himself and ask Geoff if you can ask your question, please. And please keep the questions short. We don't have much time.
Yep. My question: how do we help China become the global leader that we all so desperately need?
John, excellent question. On that, I'll sort of try and duck out of it a little bit by saying that we're not going to get a single global leader, but we do want China, which is already a dominant power, to behave in ways which give us greater certainty, and behave in ways which are fair and which are based on everyone having a reasonable chance in the order, and not just based on brute exercise of power. And I don't have an easy answer, a direct answer to that, John, but my talk about hedging China is something I see as a strategy to try and shape China's behavior so that there is an order that's based on agreements and understandings and on negotiated treaties and outcomes, and not just on the brute exercise of power. The optimistic point I'd put on that is that if you follow my argument about China being Prometheus bound, it is constrained in its capacity to shape an order based solely on its own power.
So, Geoff, I might give you a couple of questions to try to speed things up a little bit. We do have an anonymous question from one of our participants, which I'll read out, and then I'll call on Catherine to ask her question. So the first question is, how can you explain China setting up concentration camps to persecute millions of Uyghurs and other minorities through the perspective of constrained in resources? And Catherine, I might call on you now to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Together.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. It's with regard to Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and the withdrawal of the US troops come September later this year. And I was just wondering what Geoff's thoughts were around that, given China's investment, substantial investment in those areas, and the potential re-rise of the Taliban, and given Australia is looking to develop closer links with India.
Yeah, well, in some ways, the two questions basically overlap, and that is that they can all be understood, I think, through Beijing's concerns about peripheral security. As I said in the previous answer, one before, Beijing is absolutely paranoid about territorial integrity and keeping the whole show together. And, you know, it's an old joke, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're not being followed. And China's been fragmented on many occasions. And yeah, look, I mean, the reports, such as they are on what's happening in Xinjiang, really the enormity of them cannot be underestimated. But from a Beijing perspective, this is less about ethnicity and more about territorial integrity, and the fear, and that goes to Catherine's question, the fear that China's open porous borders through that region, and if you've traveled through that region, you know it's impossible to secure them. You know, the Pamirs are a major bloody open mountain range between Xinjiang and Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, and similarly on the western side with again Afghanistan and Tajikistan. So this is a major strategic headache for China, a major problem for China. Clearly, it has excellent relations with Pakistan. It's I think, very concerned about Taliban influence from Afghanistan into Xinjiang. And of course, with India, it's got ongoing border issues. But China and India, since they fought a proper war back in 1961 or two, have managed all these difficulties now for 60 odd years. And I do think they've got the capacity to continue to manage those. But for Beijing, this is a major area of security vulnerability, weakness, and real concern.
Okay, so we've got another question here from Beeple. I hope I've said your name correctly. Would you like to ask Geoff a question?
Thank you for letting me ask the question, and thanks, Geoff, for your wonderful presentation. I want to know if we are in the point where Australia-China relationship has deteriorated to the worst point. If you have to tell in 1, 2, 3, like main point, what are the reasons that lead us to this situation?
Thanks, people. Well, I think I covered some of them off. Firstly, when the US changed its assessment of China as a country with which it sought strategic engagement to one where it sought strategic competition and containment, then we shifted our assessment of China with the United States because of the very, very close links between our two countries' security and military establishments. Then secondly, I think a real failure of diplomacy by Australia. I don't think we really had prepared ourselves, even though Hugh White had warned us a decade ago, that foreign policy, strategic policy, diplomacy was going to get really, really hard for Australia, given our economic dependency on China, as China rose and became a dominant, assertive power in the region. And the manifestation of that, point 3, has been that we've handled these issues like banning Huawei, introducing anti-foreign interference law, calling for an inquiry into the origins of COVID. Not that there was anything wrong with any one of those policies, but we did it in a completely inept way, and did it in a way that made China and the Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping and so on, lose face. And so we're receiving the retaliation and retribution for that.
Interesting. Brenda, we've
very
got a question from Brenda. I'll invite you to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. Geoff, do you believe China will move to reunite with Taiwan? And if so, how do you think the US and Australia will respond, given that they've been very loud and vocal about saying we won't let that happen? So, thank you.
Yeah, it's a question of the day, Brenda, and I don't really have a good answer in the book. I argue and set out quite clearly why I believe that Beijing does not have a military option for Taiwan. I won't go through all of that, but I just don't think there's a military option. And part of it is because, of course, China's utter dependency on world markets for all its energy and resources. There would be a massive economic blockade on China if it were to precipitously try to reunite Taiwan with the mainland using military means. Military will continue to be used to harass and unsettle Taiwan. I think that's true. I mean, Xi Jinping has made it a clear objective of his that part of his legacy will be reunification. I think he'll be lucky if he achieves that. But the best China could do would be to make the mainland more attractive to Taiwan to wish to reunify, but that's not going to happen whilst the Communist Party is running the show. So I think there will be pretty much a status quo, but with China trying to undermine, mainland China trying to undermine the legitimacy of the democratic processes in Taiwan. But again, I'm not sure it's going to be that successful for them, because if you look at the last election, in terms of political interference, cyber attack, you name it, the assault was massive from the mainland on Taiwan, and the DPP President Tai got a record high vote. So whatever China did was actually useless. It didn't shape the outcome at all. And I think therein is the problem for Beijing. I feel Beijing's lost the younger generation of Taiwan, who no longer want, like their parents, to reunify with the mainland, and basically want Taiwan to have an identity that stands apart from the mainland. So that's a very, very, very big challenge for Beijing, and I don't think there's an easy resolution. As for the US and Australia and so on, I think it's not a question of reunification that's the problem, it's the means by which it's done. I think we will all end up being spectators as China seeks to shift opinion in Taiwan in some way towards some form of reunification. Possibly the best Xi will achieve in his time will be, could be, and this is probably what he's hoping for, the beginning of some process that may lead to reunification, a negotiation process. But we're a long way from that as well at present.
I think I have time to squeeze in one brief question, and it's a big question, but I hope that you can contribute to it. You mentioned that Australia will continue to rely economically on China, but there seems to be a lot of optimism about diversification. What's your view on economic diversification? Is this wishful thinking, or are we in a position to really move away from China as an economic partner?
Well, it's wishful thinking. Who's going to buy the iron ore that's keeping the economy going now, other than China? You know, India's steel production is something like, I mean, India's got iron ore in any case, but India's steel production is something like 110 tons per annum. That's where China was in about 1994. So diversification is wishful thinking if it means diversification whilst maintaining our living standards. Of course, we can diversify wherever we like, and we're free to do so, but it will be at a much lower level of living standards than what we have today. And that's partly, I think, something that's missing from the public discussion. The government needs to be more upfront. And when it says we've got choices, sure, But here's the economist in me again, choices at what cost? And how much of a threat does China pose, and what price do we really want to pay? And I think that's not properly discussed.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank you, Geoff, for this very stimulating discussion. You've really kicked off our China in Focus seminar series in great style. And I would love to thank our audience for attending this seminar and for the questions that you have posed today. Our next China in Focus seminar will be with Dr. Jason Jiang on alcohol consumption and the risk of stroke in middle-aged and older adults in China. And it's the same time next week. I hope to see you there, but thanks again for attending the seminar today.